I was not quite a teenager yet when a singer from Florida named Jim Stafford started scoring hits on the Top 40 radio. Novelty songs were his thing. His biggest hit was called Spiders and Snakes, a song about a boy who had a girl he wanted to woo, whose name was Mary Lou. And his method was to show her a frog that he had caught in the local swimming hole. But it turned out that neither frog nor spider nor snake could woo Mary Lou. But it was Stafford's first hit that always refused to leave the recesses of my brain. It was called Swamp Witch, about a magical woman named Hattie who lived way back in a Florida bayou. Stafford's opening lines and their description of the swamp caused my timbers to shiver.
Blackwater Hattie lived back in the swamp where strange green reptiles crawl. Snakes hang thick from the cypress trees like sausage on a smokehouse wall.
Could not get that out of my head. Snakes, dozens of them, hanging from tree limbs like sausages in a smokehouse. One of my uncles had a smokehouse. I knew what that looked like, but snakes? My brain was forever imprinted. The swamp was a very scary place, full of dank smells, dense fog, and dangerous reptiles. And thank goodness this never turned into an outright phobia as I grew up, but it did turn into a metaphor for the place where I grew up, the American South. Southern history is a swamp, metaphorically. Millions of Southern kids in my generation and later were taught false versions of our region's history because the daughters of this or the sons of that believed the truth should be obscured, hidden, relegated to the swamp. But in every corner of the South, the truth also lingers in the air. Sometimes it's celebrated, sometimes forgotten, sometimes it's purposefully muffled. And one such truth is the story of the U.S. colored troops. The colored troops comprised nearly 200,000 black men, most of them formerly enslaved, who joined the U.S. military to fight against and ultimately defeat the Confederacy in the Civil War. Today, we intend to bring the story of the U.S. colored troops out of the swamp, their fight for freedom from slavery, the families they carried with them, and their legacy, which still shapes the culture and history of the American South. To tell you the story of the USCT, this month on Salvation South Deluxe, we will introduce you to two fascinating historians, Holly Pinheiro of Furman University in South Carolina and Carnegie Mellon University in Pennsylvania's Etta Fields Black, whose book on this history just won the Pulitzer Prize. You'll meet Steve Fann, the Chief of Interpretation and Education at the Camp Nelson National Monument in Nicholasville, Kentucky. Camp Nelson was the largest recruitment and training center for the U.S. colored troops. And finally, you'll hear from Frank X. Walker, the legendary Kentucky poet whose latest book turns the real stories of colored troops, soldiers, and their families into poetry. I'm Chuck Reese, and welcome to Salvation South Deluxe, a monthly series of in-depth pieces that we add to our regular podcast feed. In deluxe episodes, we try to unravel the untold stories of the Southern experience by letting you hear the authentic voices of Southerners who make this region truly unique. In the summer of 1862, the second summer of the Civil War, the United States Congress passed two laws that led to the formation of the U.S. colored troops. The first was the Confiscation Act, which authorized Union officers to free enslaved blacks. Second was the Militia Act, which allowed President Abraham Lincoln to enlist free blacks and former slaves in the U.S. Army. Then, on New Year's Day of 1863, President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which set forth, in his words, quote, that on the first day of January in the year of our Lord, 1863, all persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of a state shall be then, thenceforward, and forever free. The Confederate States did not comply, of course. They were trying to form their own nation. But some U.S. states, like Kentucky, were afraid to leave the Union, but they also refused to free their slaves. 5 months later, the U.S. government made clear its intention to bring emancipated slaves into the fight. On May 22, 1863, the United States War Department issued General Order No. 143, which established the Bureau of Colored Troops to organize, recruit, and oversee African American soldiers who served in the U.S. Army during the Civil War. From a practical perspective, those events of early 1863 told enslaved men this: if you can escape from your owners and reach Union lines, you can enlist in the U.S. Colored Troops and win your legal freedom.
And they needed those refugees during the Civil War to wage and win a war, even if they don't want to provide them at times with resources, with protections, with food, with money, and yet dangling out, your men should fight and die for this country. And so for some of those refugees, they're understanding that they have power, a lot of power.
That's Dr. Holly Pinheiro at Furman University. In 2022, Dr. Pinheiro published a book called The Family's Civil War, Black Soldiers and the Fight for Racial Justice, a book that provides us with a wealth of details about members of the U.S. Colored Troops. But the book goes a step further to help us understand how enslaved people's service in the USCT was part of the longer struggle for racial justice. African American soldiers were already in place on the Union side before General Order 143 made the USCT official. And here, the legendary Harriet Tubman becomes part of the Colored Troops story. Most of us know about Tubman's role in the Underground Railroad, which helped enslaved people reach relative safety after they escaped. But far fewer of us know about Tubman's role as a strategist and a spy for the Union Army.
She was the architect of one of the most successful and dramatic Union raids in the Civil War.
That is Dr. Etta Fields Black of Carnegie Mellon University. And the raid she speaks of is the Combahee River Raid. Her 2024 book about that raid was called Combahee: Harriet Tubman, the Combahee River Raid, and Black Freedom During the Civil War. The book won the Pulitzer Prize for History. Now, the raid began on the evening of June 1st, 1863, and ended the next day after the Union Army invaded Confederate plantations along the Combahee River in the South Carolina Low Country. During the night, the U.S. Army destroyed homes and rice mills on those plantations and liberated 700 enslaved people.
I think it's safe to say that the Combahee raid was built on Tubman's intelligence that she gathered. I think it's safe to say that she was a part of reconnaissance missions on the Combahee plantations before the raid.
On that June evening, Tubman and Union Army Colonel James Montgomery set out from Beaufort, South Carolina, on a fleet of Union gunboats. I'll let Dr. Fields Black explain how the raid proceeded.
We know, and I'm able to document in Combahee, that she, number one, she led a group of 8 or 9 spy scouts and pilots. This was her ring. This was her spy ring. And she commanded them. And she took her men to the Combahee and onto the plantations. They found the enslaved men who were forced to mine the Combahee with torpedoes. And they came back with likely the 3rd Rhode Island Heavy Artillery officers. And Tubman stayed with the women and children. The spy scouts and pilots and the officers went up and got the men again and took them back to the site and diffused the torpedoes. And this opened up the Combahee River to the Union boats. During the raid on June 1st, 1863, her men, her spy scouts and pilots, piloted Colonel James Montgomery up the Combahee River and onto the Combahee plantations. So she's engaged in the planning and the execution, and she's engaged in the leadership of this spy ring.
Wow. And why don't people know about the Combahee River raid?
Mm-hmm.
Why isn't that as much common knowledge as the Underground Railroad?
That's a good question, but the Underground Railroad is also pretty poorly documented, and documented mainly by abolitionists, white abolitionists, and some Black ones as well, who worked in various capacities, who risked their lives and their livelihoods in various capacities, helping freedom seekers get to freedom. The Civil War literature didn't really take Tubman seriously. Her Civil War service is not documented in the official military record. Her role in the Combahee raid is not documented in the official military record.
That history was also obscured by the pre-Civil War willingness of the U.S. government to make concessions to the slave states of the South. People who study African American history always confront what Dr. Fields Black refers to as the 1870 brick wall. Tracing the lineage of Black Americans back beyond that wall is very difficult. Why? Because every U.S. census before the Civil War did not count Black people by name. The 1870 census was the first time, in fact, they were counted as human beings. Before then, Black people were listed in the census only as the property of white people, identified by their first names only. One reason her book won the Pulitzer was the research Dr. Fields Black did on the other side of that wall.
And I started at the brick wall. I got as far back, my cousin got back as far back as we could go. And, those people who are listed in the 1870 census, this being the first federal document in which the majority of African American ancestors are listed by first and last name. So, and in the plantation sources, they're listed overwhelmingly by first name. And one of the things I find in Combahee is that enslaved people had last names. They certainly had last names in the community that they used and that they identified with.
Sure.
And everybody's name, everybody had a history of why they chose their name.
But before 1870, the last names they chose were never documented. The enslavers had no intention of allowing the enslaved to own anything at all, not even their names. The pain of that literal identity theft still lives in the culture of the South.
There's a man going around taking names. There's a man going around taking names. He taken my mother's name and he left my heart in vain. There's a man going around taking names.
That voice belongs to Huddie Ledbetter, Leadbelly, in a recording from the 1940s. A few years after that Swamp Witch song scared me to death, I watched a TV miniseries called Roots, which was based on the late African-American writer Alex Haley's novel of the same name, which he based on his research into his own family's history. A scene in that series showed a young African-American man named Kunta Kinte, who had been kidnapped and brought as a slave to America. He was tied by his wrists to a rack, his feet dangling above the ground. Asked his name, he replies,
Kunta Kinte.
His enslaver says, your name is Toby. And Kinte is repeatedly whipped until he agrees. Such were the men going round taking names. Dr. Fields Black found a way over the 1870 brick wall by doing research into her own family's history. Because enslaved men who escaped and joined the colored troops were entitled, just like the white Union soldiers, to military pensions, which meant that their names appeared in the Army's pension records from the 1860s.
I also went down a rabbit hole trying to sort of trace my family. And at the time thought that this was totally separate from the book I was writing. And my dad, I mentioned, Daddy was born a mile or two from where the raid took place. I was charged with some family business by our family patriarch who had passed away. And so I actually ended up going to the International African American Museum, Center for Family History.
A woman named Toni Carrier, a friend of Dr. Fields Black, is the director of the Center for Family History at the International African American Museum. That museum sits on the site of Gadsden's Wharf in Charleston, South Carolina. Historians believe that as many as 40% of the Africans brought here in chains during the height of the slave trade first touched American soil at Gadsden's Wharf.
I went with what I knew about our family. I was looking for the Fields family, and my cousin had gone to the census and gone back to our earliest known ancestor in the 1870 census. And I took it to my friend, Toni Carrier, who was the director at the time of the Center for Family History. I said, Toni, please help me. And she looked at it and she said, oh, that's Hector Fields. He's a Civil War veteran in Beaufort County. She helped me to find out that, yes, that actually was my great-great-great-grandfather.
Wow.
Who joined the 2nd South Carolina Volunteers in March of 1863. And the whole family history was laid out in the pension file.
Did you pay close attention to what she just said? She not only found the records of her great-great-great-grandfather Hector, she also found the whole family history. And this is because when enslaved men escaped and made it across the Union borders so they could enroll in the colored troops, most brought their families with them, which meant that the Army camps where the colored troops mustered also became refugee camps for their families. And the largest of those was Camp Nelson in Nicholasville, Kentucky. Are you thinking, Kentucky? Why would the Union Army muster the colored troops in a southern state? Well, you have to remember that Kentucky never seceded from the Union, and from 1862 onward, the state was firmly in the control of the U.S. Army.
Camp Nelson is a big deal for the United States. Firstly, because that was one of the largest military bases where you had USCT regiments training.
Dr. Piniero's research also covered USCT camps that were located farther north, but he says that Camp Nelson is unique among the military bases where the colored troops mustered.
What makes Camp Nelson very important and unique from northern camps like what I researched in Pennsylvania is they were inclusive spaces in the sense that they weren't just for soldiers. Camp Nelson provides opportunities for empowerment. Women were there. Women had prominent roles there. They supported the United States effort. Children were there, right? So it's not just that soldiers were there. Communities were there. Families were there. Families were formed there. Families dissolved there. People reconnected.
But Dr. Pinheiro is quick to point out that what he just said should not make any of us think that Camp Nelson was all sunshine and roses for escaped slaves. After this short break, we'll take a little trip to Camp Nelson so we can show you why. You're listening to Salvation South Deluxe. Steve Fann is the Chief of Interpretation and Education at the Camp Nelson National Monument. His work, helping visitors to understand the lives of the U.S. colored troops and their families who were refugees here, is personal to him.
As I mentioned, I'm a son of refugees. I think about my parents all the time when I'm at Camp Nelson. My father was only 19 years old when he fled Vietnam in 1975, right before Saigon fell. And
after learning from Steve Fann, I'd have to say that no Southern state embodies all the complexities and conflicts of the Civil War era more fully than Kentucky.
When you think about Kentucky, you think about some of the big battles that took place here in Perryville and Richmond, Munfordville. You think about the presidents that were born here. Lincoln and Jefferson Davis were both born in Kentucky, right? You'll hear about Confederate raids and things like that, but you don't hear too much about Camp Nelson. For us, it's a great opportunity to engage with visitors, right, on the complexities of this site. And it kind of is symbolic of the complexities of this state, the paradox of Kentucky during the war. One of the first things that we often hear from visitors, they're like, Kentucky was a Confederate state, right? And we hear that all the time. And no, Kentucky was a border state, right? It was a loyal slave state like Missouri, Maryland, and Delaware. And Kentucky will hold on to the institution of slavery as long as they can, which will impact the lives of thousands of people, including enslaved people, men that will join the U.S. Army, their families who are refugees at places like Camp Nelson as well.
If I made you think Kentucky's refusal to secede and join the Confederacy was in any way about morals, I apologize.
White Kentuckians saw loyalty to the Union in the United States as the best way to protect the institution of slavery. And Lincoln understands that very, very well, as does his administration. And he's very kind of cautious about how he treats Kentucky during the Civil War.
Although Lincoln had issued the Emancipation Proclamation and formally recognized the U.S. colored troops in 1863, the U.S. government did not allow the enlistment of African American men in the state of Kentucky until 1864.
So in 1864, really starting in June, is when the Army lifts all restrictions and they authorized the enlistment of African American men in Kentucky into the U.S. Army, known as the U.S. Colored Troops, USCT. They'll organize 8 recruiting stations across the state, the largest being at Camp Nelson, where over 10,000 black men will be assigned to a Camp Nelson regiment, one of the 8 black regiments organized here. These are freedom seekers. They're trying to escape slavery, so they're coming with wives, children, other family members. There's a lot of unaccompanied minors that are, anyone that's trying to escape slavery is coming to places like Camp Nelson because the Army is here. And this is the kind of the paradox, the incredibly difficult part of Camp Nelson, where you see triumph and tragedy at the same time. When the men join the Army, they free themselves. We call it self-emancipation. And so Camp Nelson becomes this freedom center for thousands of people. But what about their families? Literally, their wives and children. What happens to them? Well, they're literally called refugees.
If you were writing a movie about this story and you were looking for a happy ending, you might think that Camp Nelson would be the turning point. Alas, American history is not that easy.
So looking at Camp Nelson actually provides a way to realize the precarious situation that self-emancipated put themselves into, hoping to establish their lives as freed people, recognized as human beings, and also having to realize that sometimes the United States space, the camp, didn't necessarily bring with it all of the freedoms that they hoped for. And so they entered into different circumstances that were difficult for them.
difficult and complicated. Men who enlisted in the U.S. colored troops were officially emancipated from slavery, but not their families. Still, the soldiers' families came to Camp Nelson hoping to find freedom. The enlisted men's families thus formed refugee camps outside the military camp.
They're in a very precarious situation. They don't really have a status. And in a way, they would be considered, runaways,
Right.
because slavery is still legal here. It's protected by state and federal law.
And the white Union officers, well, you couldn't call them racially enlightened. They did not see these families, these refugees, as a humanitarian challenge. They saw them as a problem.
The officers here, they believe that these people are going to bring disease and break down discipline and things like that. And it's a humanitarian crisis. And so they don't want to allocate supplies and food and things like that.
Which meant that the Union troops repeatedly and forcibly expelled the refugees and destroyed their camps.
And starting in June and at least 8 or 9 times throughout the remainder of the year, the Army will forcibly expel refugees from Camp Nelson. So there's multiple expulsions.
So put yourself in the shoes of a formerly enslaved man who has risked his life and the lives of his family hoping to find freedom by enlisting in the U.S. colored troops. While you are inside Camp Nelson, the same army you have enlisted in is outside the gates, driving away your family. The last expulsion of the refugees on November 23, 1864, was the deadliest and largest. It happened during a winter storm.
During the midst of like a winter storm, over 400 refugees are expelled, and it's horrific. And within a few days, the order is rescinded, but the impact is dramatic, unfortunately, and over 100 people die as a result, including, family members of U.S. colored troops.
Only after this disaster does Lincoln's government move to change the situation at Camp Nelson. Lincoln did not want enslaved men who had escaped to stop enlisting in the U.S. colored troops because they feared for their family's safety.
And this will spur the federal government to establish the Home for Colored Refugees at Camp Nelson, which happens around this time, 1865. And that's what it's literally called, the Home for Colored Refugees. The Army will change policy, allowing refugees, all freedom seekers, to come into places like Camp Nelson. On March 3rd, 1865, Congress passes legislation which emancipates the wives and children of Black soldiers. And one of the reasons why they're doing this, they literally call it to promote the efficiency of the military. They're realizing that men are not enlisting because they can't take care of their families, right?
1 month after the emancipation of the families, Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrenders in Appomattox, Virginia. 2 months after the Confederate surrender, on June 19, 1865, word finally gets to slaves in Galveston, Texas, that they are now free. We remember this day as Juneteenth. Slavery is not officially abolished in America until the ratification of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which states, and I quote, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction." We had 34 states then, which meant that 27 had to ratify the amendment for it to become part of the Constitution. The 27th, Georgia, ratified the amendment on December 6, 1865. Voting in various states continued for another month, and 5 more states voted to ratify. But there were some holdouts.
December 6, 1865 is when the 13th Amendment is ratified. Kentucky does not ratify the amendment until 1976. And we have a timeline in our visitor center, and it starts from like 1861 until really up until this period now with the establishment of the park and things like that. And people always point that out. They're like, "Do you mean 1876?" We're like, "No, 1976." So just think about that in context.
I can't stop thinking about it. A lot of folks believe stubbornness is part and parcel of Southern culture. Sometimes that's a good thing. Sometimes it's not at all. When the 13th Amendment came before the Kentucky legislature in 1865, it was voted down. Instead, the legislators passed a resolution that claimed, and I quote, "Self-interest will induce Kentucky to treat her Negro population with perfect justice." The last state to ratify the 13th Amendment was Mississippi. In 1865, its legislature asserted that the federal government should compensate Mississippi enslavers for the loss of their so-called property. Their demand was never met. The state's symbolic ratification didn't happen until 1995, when both houses of the Mississippi legislature unanimously voted to ratify the 13th Amendment. But despite those unanimous votes, state officials never sent the required certification to the Office of the Federal Register in Washington. When that error was finally corrected almost 18 years later, the Mississippi government maintained that the delay had been nothing more than a clerical oversight. Mississippi finally submitted its certification, formally attesting that the state had ratified the 13th Amendment on February 7th, 2013. 147 years, 2 months, and 1 day after the amendment became law.
We've been emancipated more than 2 whole years. That master crawled home from the war and decided to keep our freedom to himself. I remember the urge to just sit down and do nothing for a spell, just to see what it feel like. Then they told us we can now get paid for our labor. But when we find out how little money it was, a handful of us decided what we wanted to do with our freedom was go find our beloveds that was sold off or had run away. Most of us had missing family we ain't seen since who knows when and was willing to walk the kingdom come and back just to hold them again. Working for just enough to keep you alive or laboring to put sore eyes on loved ones that made life worth living was an easy choice. What freedom come to mean was to finally own land, to build our own schools and businesses, to travel unrestricted, to simply enjoy the right to hold the hands, wipe the eyes, and kiss the cheeks of the people you love most in the world. To be able to close your eyes and rest while you pray for the strength to make it through whatever God got next. God bless every fallen soldier. So many fought for our freedom, more than 23,000 Kentuckians. This is our Jubilee. This is our Emancipation Day. This be our glorious Juneteenth.
That was the voice of one of the South's most important poets, Frank X. Walker, the founder of the Affrilachian Poets. The poem you heard Frank read, The Big Breakup, is from his book, Load In 9 Times. I know y'all are familiar with the term historical fiction, which refers to novels that are set in true historical situations and include real historical figures. Frank Walker's Load In 9 Times is historical poetry based on his deep research into the pension records of the U.S. colored troops and into the lives of their families. Walker grew up in Danville, Kentucky, just 16 miles down U.S. Highway 27 from Camp Nelson. He grew up knowing the story of the place, but not the whole story. A few years ago, he was invited to help create a project about the U.S. colored troops based on historical records that were being digitized for the first time.
And I was initially hired to write some biographies for an online humanities project that was committed to putting online all these sets of new data about African American soldiers who fought in Kentucky, who were Kentuckians, and and they had all this data, pension records, service records, medical records, and they were digitizing everything. And they knew that almost nobody knew all this historical information. And they asked me and about a dozen other writers to take a set of, material and then kind of put together these short biographies on individual soldiers, and they wanted to put them on their website. And so I did about 4 or 5 of those, and I kept being blown away by the quality of the material that I was reading. I mean, they read like short little movies to me, and I wanted to do more. And I asked permission to add some poems to the bios, and they were like, "Hell yes, please!" And so I would turn in the bios and 1 or 2 poems, and I really enjoyed that process. I mean, every time I would harvest a new set of material, these poems would just seem to fall out.
Frank's writing and research led him to uncover important facts about his own family's history, specifically the stories of his ancestors, Mary and Randall Edlund, who fought in the 125th U.S. Colored Infantry, and Elvira and Henry Clay Walker, who fought in the 12th U.S. Colored Troops Heavy Artillery.
And then I recalled in that process that, there were a couple of ancestors on my family tree that we believed had connections to the Civil War, but we had never confirmed it. And, since they had all this data and they were connected to the folks in Washington, D.C. and the Smithsonian Archives, and, they had the resources, I just gave them a couple of names.
Of people from your family tree.
People from the family tree. And a week later, they emailed me a 99-page document for one of my ancestors, Randall Edlund, and I was blown away. I knew as soon as I started reading about his life that I was going to write poems about it. I really believed even then that there was a book worth of stories worth telling.
That book, Load In 9 Times, contains 67 poems in which Frank steps into the shoes of specific members of the colored troops and their families and a few other people whose lives affected theirs. He tells their stories drawing from actual records of their lives. And the ancestors you dedicate it to are Mary and Randall Edlund, married couple, your ancestors, and Randall fought in the 125th U.S. Colored Infantry.
Yes.
And Elvira and Henry Clay Walker, namesake ancestors. And Mr. Walker fought in the 12th U.S. Colored Troops Heavy Artillery.
They did. And, we have, we're still trying to confirm, there's a William Edlund who was also mustered in the exact same day in the exact same place in Lebanon, Kentucky, and served with Randall. And we're trying to figure out if that was his oldest son or his brother. We haven't been able to confirm that yet, but so we have at least 3, maybe 4 relatives, and it's both sides of my family tree that were part of, over 10,000 soldiers, at Camp Nelson in Nicholasville, Kentucky. One of the, most undertold stories about the Civil War that I've ever, been connected to. I think that people, hear Camp Nelson, they think, okay, it's an army camp, but they don't know that it was a refugee site as well. That most of those soldiers, 23,703 soldiers from Kentucky fought in the Civil War, and most of them were stationed at Camp Nelson.
And when you talk about that 23,000, you're talking about 23,000 African-American soldiers.
African-American soldiers, and which stuns people.
And their families were refugees.
Their families were stationed almost across the street in the refugee camp that had a hospital and a school, barracks, food and clothing available for those families. And it became the first really free space in Kentucky for African Americans. And And that was never part of our history books,
Once again, we fall into the swamp that is Southern history. But the beauty of Frank X. Walker's historical poetry is that it brings the stories of the U.S. colored troops at Camp Nelson not only out of the swamp and into the sunlight, but also into vivid color. In his poems, their stories become far larger than reference points in old documents. The people come fully to life, which makes readers, like me, feel their pain, their uncertainty, and their resolve at a level that history books alone could never achieve. And I think the best way to show you that, and to end this episode, is to let Frank perform his work. I asked him to read 2 poems that appear one after the other in the book. The first is written in the voice of a slave owner, a woman named Matilda Burks. It's called After My Decease, A Last Will and Testament. The second is written in the voice of Grace, a slave owned by Matilda Burks. Frank drew the story in these 2 poems from the records. Matilda Burks was a real person.
Matilda Burks was a slave owner. Lived near Louisville, Kentucky. Her name was on the documents that we were able to unearth that had been digitized, that included the slave census that registered all 48 of her slaves. We found her actual will where she redistributed her slaves to her own children. And Grace, obviously is the mother of those children that were redistributed, but who didn't have a voice. And it was important to me after I had written this poem that tried to, raise to the surface, just how easy it was to consider people property and redistribute them. I wanted people to know what it might have felt like for the mother of those children to witness it. And then if she had something to say, imagine what she would say.
We'll leave you to listen to these 2 poems.
After My Decease, A Last Will and Testament. It's in the voice of Matilda Burks. I give and bequeath all my silverware and plate of every description, also my beds, bedsteads, bedclothes, and the remaining household and kitchen furniture to be split equally amongst my daughter and 3 sons. I give and bequeath to my daughter Nancy my forte piano, and also my Negro woman Grace, and her youngest daughter Harriet. I give to my son John all my pictures, and also my Negro boy Alfred, son of the above-mentioned Grace. I give to my son James my Negro girl Sally, daughter of the above-mentioned Grace. And to Charles, I give my Negro boy Wesley. Should the said Grace or any of her increase, or any of the 48 slaves of mine which shall become the property of any of my children, prove troublesome and unmanageable, that it is my wish that such slave or slaves so offending shall be sold, and the proceeds of such sale or sales be appropriated to the purchase of other servant or servants to supply the place or places of those sold. In witness whereof I have hereunto set my hand, and affixed my seal the 7th day of December in the year of our Lord, 1857. Signed, sealed, and acknowledged, Matilda Burks. And now mother to mother. I believes, you believes, this ink and paper testament show off your love for your children and how generous you can be. And that may be so, but it's easy to be generous when you're gone. What use a dead body got with silver and slaves? Well, I thank you for giving over my Harriet with me. I feel no such kindness for the plowing up of the rest of my children. And the added threat of being sold away for daring to say anything but yes, ma'am, and yes, a boss, have me dreaming of swinging the back of my hand and fixing my own seal. You can bind all my increase. You can sell south my ungrateful tongue, but you can't never give away my dreams. The above mentioned Grace.
I'd first like to thank Frank X. Walker for being incredibly generous with his time and for how his poetry inspired me to learn about the history that inspired him. I'd also like to thank Steve Fan of the National Park Service, Dr. Holly Pinheiro of Furman University, and Dr. Etta Fields Black of Carnegie Mellon University for teaching me well about the history of the U.S. colored troops, Camp Nelson, and Harriet Tubman. When we spoke to Etta for this episode and talked about her book, Combie, neither she nor I had any clue her book would soon win the Pulitzer Prize for History. So besides giving Etta my thanks, I want to add, congratulations. That's awesome. You've been listening to Salvation South Deluxe, proudly produced in cooperation with Georgia Public Broadcasting and its network of 20 radio stations around our state. Every week, we add a new 3-minute commentary about Southern stuff to our podcast feed, and every month or so, we add longer deluxe stories such as the one we've just told you. I'm Chuck Reese, your host and the editor-in-chief of Salvation South, which you can find 24/7 at salvationsouth.com. On our site right now, we have the Alabama poet and professor Jacqueline Allen Trimble's in-depth interview with Frank X. Walker about his book, Load In 9 Times. Our producer is Jake Cook. I thank him for his hard work and his great willingness to swim the swamps of Southern history with me. GPB's director of podcasts is Jeremy Powell, and none of this could have happened without the help of other folks at GPB like Sandy Malcolm, Adam Woodleaf, and Bert Wesley Huffman. We'll be back next month with another full-length episode of the Salvation South podcast.